Davin from Wellington, Dan's niece. Welcome to our Mayor, Dave Cull. To Bob Simpson, a trustee of Invercargill's Dan Davin Literary Foundation. To Keith Ovenden, Davin's biographer, who's come down from Wellington. To Tracy Wedge from the Southland Museum and Art Gallery. And to Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Jane Brosnan, the commanding officer of the 2-4 Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Special thanks to Dan's old friends, family and supporters who have donated to the cost of the plaque, as well as the Alexander Macmillan Trust, the Otago University Press, the English Department and the Dan Davin Literary Foundation. While you could argue that Invercargill has first claims on Southland-born Davin, Dunedin is just as proud to celebrate Dan's links to the city. That's our city. In his sixth form year, Dan won a national scholarship to Otago University, which he entered in 1931. In 1935, he graduated with an MA in English with first-class honours, and the same year won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. While still at Otago University in 1936, he gained a Diploma of Honours in Arts, Latin First Class. He became engaged to Winnie, and then set off on his own to Balliol College in Oxford. His days at Otago University saw him fully immersed in 1930s student activities, leading what some might describe as a bohemian way of life. Dunedin has certainly featured in Davin's novels and short stories. His first book, Cliffs of Fall, published in 1945, is a tale of murder and self-destruction that persuades you not to linger in the town belt after dark. And his 1970 novel of student life, Not Here, Not Now, you should see down there, is infused with Dunedin place names and local landmarks at a time when the landlady and digs long preceded mixed flatting. From the time that he left New Zealand in 1936 to his death in 1990, Dan returned to Dunedin on 5 occasions. Commissioned to write the official war history of the Battle of Crete, he visited New Zealand in 1948. In Dunedin, he and his father stayed at Ma Blaney's pub in Stafford Street. Dan walked the town, visiting old haunts. His diary recorded sentiments of Dunedin, which are now enshrined in this bronze plaque that we're about to unveil. Dan returned for a month in 1959 to deliver the Macmillan Brown Lectures at Otago, Victoria and Auckland Universities, where he spoke on his old friend Joyce Carey, the Anglo-Irish novelist. He was back again in Dunedin 10 years later in 1969 for the University of Otago centenary celebrations and caught up with old friends. One evening, he and Winnie found themselves at a party thrown by poet and Burns fellow Uni Tufari, where the mutton birds, an old favourite of Dan's, were flowing freely. Dan visited again in 1978 in his retirement year from Oxford University Press. Historian Michael King interviewed him for radio and described Dan as elegant. His voice is sonorous, he said. His conversation decidedly donnish. It reveals a wit that is both dry and wry, a weakness for puns and a fondness for literary allusion. Dan's last visit to Dunedin was in 1984, when he was 71, a trip he would not have taken if it wasn't for the University of Otago inviting him to accept an honorary doctorate of literature. There was plenty of civic pride in his return. He made front page in the Otago Daily Times and was the subject of an editorial. Dan Davin died in Oxford in 1990, and 25 years later we gather in the Dunedin Writers' Walk to honour an immigrant son who remained always the expatriate New Zealander, or as he referred to himself, an intimate stranger. Thank you. Call upon Dave Cull, our Mayor, to say a few words. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Well, a plaque commemorating Dan Davin is a welcome return to the tradition of literary plaques around the Octagon. I can't recall when the last one was placed, but it was quite some time ago. And the Octagon is definitely an appropriate place for a writer's walk, as it were, presided over as it is by Robbie Burns. And indeed, it's appropriate just hearing that the Alexander Macmillan Trust has provided some funding for this, because this statue was donated in 1967 by Alexander Macmillan, who obviously was very supportive of the literary arts. Indeed, nothing marks Dunedin's respect for literature quite so much as having a statue of Robbie Burns right in the centre of the city. Dunedin has recently attained UNESCO Creative City of Literature status, one of only 11 cities, 4 of which are national capitals. So we're doing pretty well, we're keeping august company. And the City of Literature network is, among other things, about international literary connections. So again, this is very appropriate that it's appropriate and an auspicious time to recognise one of Dunedin's greatest literary sons, albeit an adopted literary son from Invercargill. I've been adopted from Invercargill by Dunedin, so I don't see why we shouldn't claim Dan the same way. Dan Davin, who spent his creative life outside New Zealand, but whose writing was so informed and inspired by his early life and memories here. Sorry.
Now, Anna Davin, do you want to come up and say a few words before we do the unveiling?
Of course, the first thing to say is how thrilled I am to be here, and how happy about the plaque, about all of you here, about the positioning of this unveiling within the larger literary festival. It's just such a lovely combination of circumstances which gave me and my partner the excuse to do what we've been meaning to do for ages, and come to New Zealand and do the tour of cousins as well as Dunedin. So we're doing quite a circuit. I did grow up, though born in Oxford and completely reared and educated in England, my sisters and I all felt that we were not English properly. We were Irish and we were New Zealand, and those identities came before being English. So the Irish flag down there is a good reminder of how tenacious that those familial and cultural identities can be across generations, even in exile, sort of, well, displacement. But that also makes me think about how tenacious Dan's sense of being New Zealand was, with more justification, I have to say, than ours, and how, as we were just hearing, he drew inspiration for much of his writing, and I think the best of his writing, from his New Zealand origins and youth. And I'm not going to speak very long now because I am speaking at greater length down the hill. But I want to say thank you, not least to Tony, but to everybody else who's made this plaque happen. And I think that kind of initiative is something that to be not just valued and celebrated, but we should all be jumping up and down and thinking health of Tony for this inspiration, and then for everybody else. I suppose just briefly on Dunedin, which I'm going to talk more about his relationship with Dunedin anon. But it was a very formative period. Those years, 1931 to 36, were extremely important in the larger trajectory of Dan's life and of his literary and cultural achievements. And so when they used to talk about Dunedin, my parents, about New Zealand, it was to Dunedin and to their childhoods that they most often referred. Of course, it was even more true for Winnie, because she didn't have the year in Auckland and she didn't become a Rhodes Scholar as a woman, of course, who couldn't. I'm glad to say that's quite recently been amended, but for most of the, it must have been, I forget when they were started, but anyway, for decades it was a male prerogative. It was, of course, much more likely if you were from a better off family and white and all the rest of it. But female was the first absolute and spelt out thing that disqualified. Anyway, so Dunedin was the place where my parents met. It was a place where both of them developed their intellectual curiosity and excitement their networks of friendship, their sense of the world. And so thank you to me. And that makes me very happy that Dan's returning here and being recognised here as he was anyway, because it's sort of an embodiment or a materialisation of his reputation and of his Dunedin connections. I don't know if that bit was audible because I've rashly stepped aside. Right, as before.
I'll just read what's on the plaque. Get out of the way. So Dan Davin, 1913 to 1990. The blue of the hills and the Scotch mist were more beautiful than I had remembered them. I shall regret not having come here sooner and stayed longer. That's entering his personal diary on his return in 1948. University of Otago Rhodes Scholar, novelist, short story writer, soldier and war historian, literary critic and publisher at Oxford University Press, remembered for his legendary hospitality to visiting New Zealand writers.
And sculptors. And I forgot to say hello to family and friends, and please forgive me if I don't recognise everybody who I ought to recognise. I also want to say that besides my cousin Rachel, my cousin Mariana Baird is also here, although she's on the distaff side, through Winnie rather than Dan. For me, they're equal, and the connection to Dan likewise. And I also want to say welcome Victoria Stones, who I remember from the pub when she was in Oxford when she was a teenager on a visit with her father, the sculptor Tony Stones, and that was why I just jumped in and said sculptors as well as writers.
Now, in recognition of Dan Davin's war years and the influence that had him on him as a man in his writings, I just ask Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Jane Brosnan to come forward to lay some flowers on the plaque.
That's sweet, isn't it? She went to school with kids.
Amanda Jane. That ends this part of the ceremony, so feel free to take a few photos before you wander down. We've got some refreshments there at the Athenaeum before we start the next phase of